start.
Okay, happy Friday, everyone. I'm happy to be here with together with David Levi-Faur, and we have a very nice presentation today, and three very three nice scholars who are actually presenting us today something about the infrastructure of legislation or regulation. And this is a nice way um, to resettle this section of the metrics of regulation. So here with us we have Mihály Fazekas, professor from the Department of Public Policy, the Central European University. Cyril Benoît from the Science Po, who is affiliated with the Center of European Studies and Comparative Politics, and Sebastian Thieme, also from the Science Po and the Center of European Studies and Comparative Politics. And they will present us a very impressive initiative, LEGDAT, which comprises over 300,000 50 bills, 60,000 laws, and we are very curious to hear more about your project. Um, I think if we are ready, you can please start your presentations, and we are happy to follow. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Neil. So we have 1 hour overall. So let's try to have like half an hour, 40 minutes presentation, big maximum, and then um, open discussion if I understand correctly. And of course, for the audience, if you have any clarifying questions immediately while we talk, please feel free to raise your hands, and then um, we will try to answer. So thanks a lot for having us. I think the idea of this presentation came when David was at CU as a visiting fellow, which unfortunately ended, but hopefully we have you back in Vienna sometime soon. As Neil mentioned, so this is a collaborative effort between Sebastian, Cyril, and myself, and also we have Dominic Brenner, who couldn't be here as an earlier collaborator, and also from the Central European University. This effort is ongoing. It has been funded initially by the Open Society University Network, OSUN, and currently is funded by the European Commission's Horizon Euro program under the Respond project, which is still running, and is a sister project of Bridge Gap. Some of you might know David is working in that. So there is a lot going on, and we hope to benefit from your feedback either now or later on, shaping the next 2 to 3 years of data collection, which is still in front of us. The outline is very straightforward, very quickly motivations. I think for this crowd, we don't need to emphasize the importance of this kind of data too much. And then I pass it on to Sebastian to talk about how we collect data, how does our data collection infrastructure look like, and some details on the data. And very few applications. I really just highlight a few interesting ideas. I'm sure you will have more and far more diverse ideas than we have had so far. And the idea is really that we collect this data, give it back to the community, and then you can run with it. You can send us your feedback, and then we can contribute to the wider debate. And the final point in the agenda will be a little bit on what's next in the next 6 months, 12 months or so, in terms of publishing more data, and we move on to adding regulatory data to legislative data, and we would be very happy to hear your feedback on those. So the motivations are twofold. First, There has always been a lot of data on legislative outputs, in particular text of laws, some information on processes making these laws, like vote shares, but traditionally this has been on paper, which has now moved onto electronic in most part of the high and middle income countries, and increasingly moving electronic in low income countries as well. And also historically, paper-based records are being digitized. Now, this data is becoming increasingly accessible and easily accessible, like parliamentary APIs. I mean, I think 10 years ago, this would have been like a joke if I use these two words next to each other. Now it's something parliaments actively seek. So this is great. The second main element of this revolution is not just we have the data we used to have, say 100 years ago now in electronic format, but also there's a lot more detail being recorded and often made available on the various procedural steps like committees, speeches, amendments, and a lot of interesting aspects of how laws and regulations are made, which were previously not available, not recorded. We are not, of course, the first ones moving in this space. There is a large and rich literature, which we are very happy to contribute to. First, there have been efforts on recording, understanding, documenting actors of lawmaking, cabinets, members of different political parties, so on and so forth. Second, there has been a lot of work on legislative outputs, such as laws, comparative agendas project CUP should be mentioned here among many others, but have been increasingly projects looking at some aspects of the process of making laws and regulations, mainly speech linked to bills and laws, less the process aspects, which we find important. And then there are, of course, some individual papers looking at different aspects of these. What's important is that most of these are Europe and US focused, not exclusively, but mostly, which understand funding interest where we are as researchers, but I think this literature will benefit from broadening the country sample, which we again try to contribute to. So let me stop here with the preliminaries and pass on the mic to Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you, Michi. So I would like now to give you an overview of the data and that we've collected so far, as well as the data collection process more generally. So as I'll go into more detail, we're basically collecting these data from the websites, scraping the data and then parsing them, working together with an IT company. At the moment, we have uploaded data on bills and laws and legislative processes on 16 countries that are listed here in the table. That was also produced for a journal submission of the first version of the data. You can also see the countries on the map here. So as Michi mentioned, the geographic coverage is not limited to the United States and Europe, but also goes to South America. We have South Africa, India, Australia, Russia, countries that are not usually included in these types of data collection processes, data collection projects. If you look at the temporal coverage, you'll see that it's also quite large. So we're generally trying to collect all the data that can be accessed from the websites. Of course, taking into account the quality as well. At some point there might be need to be a cutoff, but generally the data become available from the 1990s. And our unit of observations, we generally start with bills, and then we're collecting information on the laws if those bills get turned into laws, if they get adopted. In some cases, we may also have laws without the relevant bill information. but generally we start out with laws. So you and you already heard at the beginning, we have over 350,000 observations. Those data are already uploaded. You have the link here on the slides, the Global Corruption Observatory. And as was also mentioned, the data collection is ongoing, and we intend to regularly update the GCO website. To give you a little bit of the sense of what this process involves, so we're working, as I mentioned, with an external vendor, an IT company, and I think in this respect, it's a quite innovative approach of collecting the data. We start out sort of relatively classically with an RA identifying the websites and scoping out the availability of the variables. And then we have the IT team check whether the data generally is feasible to collect. RAs would then, under our supervision, create so-called variable guides, which are instructions for both scraping and parsing the data from the websites based on a standardized list of variables. And I'll show you some of the variables in a moment, and I'll also give you an example of what this looks like in practice, a screenshot from one of those variable guides. So once that's been created by the RA, we check the variable guides, and the IT company checks it as well. So we have meetings where, together with the RA and the IT company, we go through any issues that might arise, be they substantive or technical, and might make some adaptations, modifications based on feasibility if something is sort of hard to standardize or automatize. The IT company then implements those instructions and exports the data, after which the RA and us check the first export of the data, which is done both in a quantitative way, checking for missing rates or empty values, but also in a more qualitative way, where we take random subsets of bills, for example, 50 bills, but also random subsets of past bills to focus. Oftentimes it will be the case that there's a relatively low proportion of past bills. So it's important when you're taking the random sample, of course, to also do a selective subsample of past bills. And there, for those samples, we check, or the RA checks every variable for whether they match the value on the website. And once that's done, we get back to the IT company for any errors in the parsing. And we may also update the variable guide based on the inconsistencies between what we want to collect and what was collected. And so then it goes back to the IT company, and we iterate this process, if necessary, multiple times until a sufficient level of quality is achieved. Once the data is all complete, we may calculate additional fields, for example, the economic sector or risk factors that I'll mention in a second, based on the data that was collected, for example, the bill text. So just to make things a little bit more concrete, and this is a relatively simple example, but so here you see an example instruction from the Netherlands variable guide, which is a country for which data collection is ongoing, or has actually been generally been done now, almost. And so here you see the variable bill title, and there's a screenshot of a website. Usually this would be accompanied also by a URL that's at the bottom of the screenshot, so that the IT company can identify where on the website and where in the HTML code, assuming it's HTML, it would be located, the variable. Here is the list of key variables. These are not all the variables that we're collecting, but these are the sort of the key variables. And so you have information about the originators of legislative proposals and their institutional or partisan affiliations. We also reporting the status of the bills and the time spent by a bill in the legislative process, as well as the modifications it has encountered, and also the size of the law, as well as additional information related to committee involvement and votes. Not all of these variables are always available, but we try to collect the data whenever they are available. Yeah, and I'll get, or Michi might also focus more on the indicators later on, but I'll just say that these are collected based on, or coded based on other variables, such as the size of the laws relative to laws in the country in general, or based on the speed of bill passage, for example. And Michi already mentioned that we're not the first to be active in this space. Some pertinent previous projects are the Comparative Agendas project, as well as Parallel Speech. There isn't a sort of perfect overlap in the countries that were studied, but there is a partial overlap. And here I'm showing you some examples from that overlap, where we have LEGDAT. We have the number of bills in a given year that were introduced in the left column, and the number of laws enacted in a given year for 3 different countries: Germany, Hungary, and the US, for which there is overlap. There are some other countries where there's overlap as well, but this is just sort of as an example. As you can see here, generally, our data collection tracks very well what has been collected in other countries. For Germany, we know that there's a bit of a discrepancy based on, in terms of the bills introduced to the Comparative Agendas project, based on bills that might not be formally recognized as such. If they're introduced, if a legislative motion is introduced in the upper chamber, and in Hungary, we're identifying the source of discrepancy between bills and laws. US, you can see a perfect or near perfect overlap. And so you can see that in general, it tracks very well with the data that we're collecting with previous efforts to collect such data. In terms of descriptive statistics, I just want to sort of pull out a few examples of the variables. Here you can see 4 radar plots and 7 different variables that are plotted on these. On the top left, you see in red the median committee count. So across the data set in a given country, and also across all countries in the data set, you see the median number of committees that are involved for a given bill or any bill. And so you see some variation there. And you also see variation in the median stages count. Some of this is based on sort of a further need to standardize the stages, but you do also see a lot of variation more generally across countries in the number of steps or stages of scrutiny that a bill might encounter. And on the right, you see both the percentage of government bills and the percentage of bills that are passed. And so this, if you look at the examples, tracks very closely with parliamentary, or the variation tracks very closely with parliamentary and presidential systems. For example, in the US, there's, of course, no government bills introduced. Also have very low proportion in Chile and Colombia of government bills, but in generally you see a high percentage of government bills that are introduced and a high percentage of bills that are passed, although these are not always necessarily government bills. Similarly, yeah. Is there a question? No, sorry. Yeah, and similarly, when you look at bill and law size, you see also a wide variation in terms of the size of the bills and the size of the laws. Here I should say bill size, we're focusing on the size of the initially introduced bills in terms of number of characters. Yeah, and then standard law versus technical law. Here we're also focusing on the size of bills of the laws. If they're relatively small, then we classify them as technical. So most of them don't fall into the category of technical law. Michi, if you...
Yeah, just one addition. If you want to get back to this technical versus standard law, we can discuss it later on, but we are not convinced that a law is the natural unit of observation in any future analysis, because laws are actually very different from each other. And this is our first attempt to filter out the kind of noise from the data, but really we can get back to this later.
Thanks. Yeah, and here you also see very interestingly variation in the time spent, median time spent in Parliament. Although in general, for many countries, it's on the order of let's say around 200 days is the median number of days. And we're also collecting information on the average number of annual modifications, which captures the temporal or the stability of laws across time. So how often does a law get changed by subsequent legislation? And then we see in the radar plot 7 variation in the percentage of initiatives by the government or whether it's not by the government. And and we also see, if you look at the plot 8, a lot of variation in the proportion of bills that fall within the threshold of having been passed in a very short period of time, under 10 days. But Michi will speak more about these indicators in the applications, but yeah, I'll pass it on to you, Michi.
Great, thanks a lot. So we covered great material. Any immediate questions, or shall I quickly highlight a couple of uses? Okay, so obviously this data can be used for lots of different things. So this is just a bunch of examples to inspire thoughts. So the first one is legislative stability, or with a bit of concept stretching, we can call it legislative predictability, which is one of the fundamental pillars of rule of law. And these charts are actually pretty sad. Maybe you don't realize it immediately, but basically what you see here, these are smoothed modification, first modification probability charts per country, with the month since initial enactment or passing the law in the parliament. And so these are all conditional. Given that the law hasn't been modified month 10, what's the probability of being modified month 11? And then you move this on for each month. And what's said about these is that our beloved representatives spend a lot of time on carefully crafting laws, and I would have expected that these lines, these probability charts, would be like either linear, just upward sloping, or kind of flat for a long time, and then a kind of J-shaped curve that at one point the probability goes up. Instead, what you see is a hump in all of the countries. Of course, the height is different, but in all of the countries, you have a hump around month 10, month 12. So this means that the highest probability that the law is going to be modified the first time after being passed is within the first 12, 16 months. And it's bad, right? Because if you modify a law very quickly after it has been passed, it means it was badly drafted, right? If you pass a law and you implement it, and then a few years later you realize the world has moved on, then, that's, to me, it's more like sign of predictability, sign of quality. So that would be like 0, 0 probability or very low, and then starting to go up after a few years. So 24, 36, something like that. But the fact that we don't have that, and in some countries the spike is pretty high, like Hungary, for example, but also if you look at Chile, you look at France, this initial spike is pretty bad. So this is not like any causal analysis, but it does tell you something interesting about legislative processes, the predictability and stability of laws, and more broadly, the quality of lawmaking. The next application, moving on from, or still remaining within the rule of law, but moving away from predictability aspects, looking at favoritism or impartiality or lack of impartiality in the legislative process and the legislative outputs. And basically, conceptually, this is, of course, very difficult. And then if there are lawyers among you, you will not be happy with how we simplify lots of things. But basically, legislative favoritism is a phenomenon which relates to the passage of legislation which disproportionately advantages a specific firm or group of firms over their competitors within the economic sector. So within a sector where we would expect equal treatment, so impartiality before the law. And we simply think, and this is very really approximate favoritism, we think that when procedural discretion is higher, when lawmaking process doesn't leave space and room and opportunity for checks and balances, controls, reviews, are the situations when favoritism is more likely to happen. So simply speaking, if there are fewer eyes watching, it's easier to hide some specific favors because company X or Y has given a large donation. There are lots of examples of this, but of course, there are also cases when lack of scrutiny doesn't necessarily translate into favoritism, is just bad practices. So a couple of indicators, proxy indicators, and underlined twice, proxy indicators for legislative favoritism. You can look at excessive legislative production, so suddenly a lot of laws, very long, many texts before parliament. No one has time to, carefully think these through. Lack of parliamentary debate, or fast track legislation, which Sebastian already mentioned. So this is the number of days the bills are in parliament before passing. We use the threshold of 10 days in line with the OECD's integrity indicators. But when we actually use this in various research papers, then we usually look at different cut points because 10 days is a round number, but there's nothing theoretically founded in it. Non-standard procedure, non-government actors, MPs initiating bills typically make the bill exempt from the usual procedural safeguards such as public consultation, impact assessments, so on and so forth. Of course, there's variation across countries, but by and large, this is something which we can see in countries. Omnibus legislation is where very many different legislative activities are bundled together. So we have a law which is giant. Some people call these monster bills, and they modify very different sectors: the finance, the agricultural sector, law on trade unions, and all voted on as one process. And then this complexity and diversity makes checks harder. And then frequency of modifications. Again, there are techniques used by favoritistic actors or corrupt actors simply by passing the initial law as everything perfect by the book. 2 months later, there is a modification substantially changing important aspects of it, and this modification goes without formal checks, goes without proper debate. So just, putting this in a cross-country setup, because we have quite many countries and years. We also have some results within country. For the moment in the UK, looking at companies within the various sectors laws regulate, but I guess the cross-country results are relatively telling. So we have GDP per capita, purchasing power parity in dollars as an outcome variable, and we look at whether omnibus laws, so we're having more omnibus laws or more extraordinary laws, are having a negative impact on GDP per capita growth. And the finding is yes, across different specifications like country, year, fixed effects, we find, of course, varying, but in every specification, substantial negative effects, like 2% of the GDP growth rate going down as a result of unit increase in the presence of these omnibus laws of extraordinary or fast track legislation. The non-government laws and frequent modification to laws don't have this observed effect, even though it might be just due to a relatively small sample size. So this is something which we are going to explore further. And this is not, any hard-nosed causally well-identified analysis. Is just to tell you something interesting about these factors and the value of this data, that it can uncover some interesting findings. So this was just two very quick, one micro and macro applications of the data. And as we add more data, we hope that these applications become more and more valuable for the community. So where are we going from these 60,000 laws and 16 countries? We are adding new countries and territories or entities such as the European Parliament, mainly European focus of our additions: Austria, Italy, Netherlands, Serbia, Sweden, and Ukraine. We are currently finalizing these, hoping to gradually release them in the next 2 months, and then we move on to a next batch of countries. While we're adding new countries, we're also fixing some known errors. Sebastian already mentioned this 5 to 10% missing data in our bills in Germany because they are initiated in an unusual way. So these sorts of mistakes we are finding in various ways, and then basically we're fixing them. So here is a call for you. If you download our data, you use it, and you realize there is something wrong with it, please do take your time, send an email to us with a precise description of the error. We are working on these countries. We are very happy to fix them. We know the data is not perfect, but by using the data sets, we can improve them. So in addition to legislative data, and this is something new, something which we have started to pilot a few months ago, and we are into the first full data collection process for the UK. We are adding regulations, regulatory data, so not what's happening in Parliament, but what's happening in regulatory agencies, government decrees, and presidential decrees, and similar activities. We are collecting this data and pull them into a standard data dictionary, parse them into a standard data structure. We have IDs of the regulation, of course, IDs relating to modifications and so backward and forward in the network of modifications. We have, if possible, the authorizing legislation information, the body which is originating the regulations, naturally the title and text of these, as much as possible, but it very much varies on the kind of regulatory process. We gather process dates, proposal, adoption, entering into force, status variable, if possible, withdrawn, in force, so on and so forth. And then where available, public consultation and impact assessment. But again, there's large cross-country variation in terms of whether regulatory texts are subject to such a public consultation and impact assessments. So these are our thoughts. And the idea is, again, to publish all these along the data dictionary and the data description article, and then make it available for your use. Thanks a lot. We are looking forward to feedback on the legislative data and also on the regulatory data if you have any suggestions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mihi, Sebastian, and Cyril, and we're happy to collect comments and questions. I do have, but I'll be patient for now. So please raise your hand or just pop in with any comment in your mind. Okay, maybe I will start if no one else is okay. Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much. It's a very impressive work. I think that the far away maybe leading initiative in that scale. So well done for this. It's really impressive. I do have a lot of technical questions. Some already been collected myself. Some comparative data on laws and regulations, but I'll start with something a bit else. So if we think about, for example, the comparative agendas project, they had in mind the driving logic behind the comparative agenda project was a theoretical. So the whole idea of the punctuated equilibrium theory was in mind of why we actually collect a lot of data and classify it. And my question, if you have something similar in mind, or it's just a collective effort to actually create the infrastructure. I'm also quite interested, or my personal interest is more about the text than and any other stuff. I think that's quite impressive, and I'm also wondering if you have there any kind of a work in progress or anything that could actually exemplify what are the potential, the theoretical potentiality of this massive amount of data collection. So I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to hear your take on that.
I guess we collect a bunch of questions and then we reply to them. Or how do you?
As you wish. I think we have an intimate. Maybe we can collect two more questions, one from Sebastian and the other one from Mihály, and then we can continue to the second round. So Sebastian, please go ahead.
Hi there. I guess it's this Sebastian, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It sounds really great and interesting. I kind of wanted to maybe add on a point that Nir kind of referred to, but not explicitly. I'm just wondering, kind of, do you also collect the texts behind that? Because that, I guess, is what many people would be interested in. So I understand you're interested primarily in the process, but I would suspect that most people are maybe more interested in the bills and the adopted laws themselves. I understand, obviously, that this can be challenging, particularly looking back in time and finding kind of older text. But in relation to that, do you kind of have a pipeline for that in mind as well? So you set these things up, and then maybe later people can add these particularly older texts, maybe that are difficult to find at the moment. So are you thinking about these kind of things, I guess, is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Mihály, please.
Thank you. Nice to see everyone. So first of all, I join you with congratulating you. I think it's an amazing project, and I think it makes a very big contribution. maybe I could follow up on Neil's question of perhaps what theoretical questions could be relevant here. I think there's a great potential, even in the paper that you already released, to delve into the discussions about whether a good process creates a good law and whether bad process creates bad law. And of course, there's a lot of writing about it. How do you define what is a good process and how do you find what is a good law? But I think at least one of the measures is the pace of the legislative process and the extent of the bill, which two measures that you measure. And in terms of what is bad law, favoritism or a law that serves special interest instead of the public, I think would be relatively agreed upon definition. So I think this really could make a very good contribution. And I think from the research I've known and studied, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence showing that omnibus legislation and fast-track legislation creates special interest legislation. But this is the first empirical study that I've seen that can support it. So I think this could be a paper in itself, and there's a lot of potential here. I can say anecdotally, at least in Israel, I've been in debates about it with our Ministry of Finance, because in Israel, all omnibus legislation is created by, it's called the arrangement laws, and it's created by the Ministry of Finance. They claim, and it was very interesting for me to see, they claim that they need it in order to overcome special interest legislation and favoritism. Of course, their narrative is that you can't trust parliamentarians and the MPs because they are much more influenced by lobbyists, etc. While we, the government, if we can push through whatever we want through an omnibus bill, then we can actually pass things that lobbyists and special interest groups would not like. My intuition is closer to your findings than their claim, but as I said, could be very, very interesting to see. And a very small technical question. As Neil said, I have many other technical questions, but just one in terms of how to define omnibus legislation. I saw something about two standard deviations. If you can say a bit more about how you define omnibus legislation, because this is also an area that there's a lot of debate about in the scholarship. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Itai. Yeah, and I think we can have your feedback now.
Great. This is a great range of questions. So I don't know, Sebastian, Cyril, may I start and then you pick up or add wherever you feel? I can guarantee you that there is no consensus about some of these things in the research team, and I think it's a great thing. Let me start with the simpler technical related questions. So what text is currently being collected? We collect text by default, which means typically the bill text, so the initial version, and the final adopted law text. So these two are nearly always present. We attempt to collect other textual information, in particular the text of the modifications, so amendments in the parliamentary debate. This is not as neatly reported by parliamentary website as I would like to. So this is a problem. Of course, this data is always somewhere, held by someone, but in terms of standard and collectible data, this is very hard. Now, we also collect data on what happens to already passed laws when a new law is passed. So which sentence is changed, which paragraph is changed. Again, this is very hard. Like I would like to highlight to Cyril's delight that the French Parliament's website, which is very neat and very nice, properly hyperlinked and referenced which paragraph, which sentence is modified by which law passed. So you can really trace back changes in existing laws. So that is our ideal, and really is only the French Parliament, which is ahead of the pack in this, like really making this traceable and machine readable. And then you get to the US, which is a disaster. Like even if you read it, it's like very hard to know what exactly changes to which new wording. So this part is very hard. But indeed, text is a core interest to us. In terms of omnibus, so thank you very much for pointing out the difficult and unsatisfactory part of our data. So for the moment, we just look at indeed the very large bills, and that's very simple. Once we have this economic sector classification more reliable across all our countries, then we want to extend the definition not only long, but also regulating or impacting on a large number of very different sectors, right? So this would be sort of our definition, and then we would just impose one and then let people change it if they like changing the parameters. If they don't like two standard deviation, make it 1.5. If you don't like, 5 different sectors regulated, make it 4. So these sorts of things you want to give it to the user. Now, the difficult one on theoretical frame, and I'm looking at my colleagues, so we don't have one overarching guiding theoretical frame. In many respects, we have our research interests and the theoretical frames for those, but we want to let the data speak and people do whatever they want to do with this data, from economics to regulation scholars to political scientists and you name it. So our main interest for the moment is on special interest politics, favoritism, rule of law, and these activities around them. And one thing we haven't mentioned, but this is in the research pipeline, and this is very important. A lot of people have written a lot of things about what's good lawmaking process, how good law should be structured, but barely ever, and I use this word, barely ever it has been tested in simple things like what happens with the companies being regulated. Do you dramatically decrease their productivity? Do you increase their productivity? Or, environmental outcomes, like do we get better environmental outcomes in those sectors? So there are some attempts at this, but you want to do this at scale. With Cyril, we have a paper looking at the UK, and indeed, when you have omnibus legislation, fast-track legislation, we have an impact on the distribution of profit within the sector. Some companies are racing ahead and the bulk is left behind. So sort of when we say 10 days of fast-track legislation is the right threshold, or 50 days, I don't know. But if I link it to outcomes, such as what happens with companies a year or two after in the regulated sector, then I can trace it back to the lawmaking process features and then verify our assumptions, whether, things like regulatory impact assessments or long parliamentary debate are good things. And I know, company profitability is not the only outcome we care, but this is one everyone would agree that if sectoral profitability goes down because some crazy omnibus law is just changing everything overnight, then probably this was bad lawmaking process. So this kind of moving from the kind of bubble of parliament and seeing what happens outside and making these links, and then updating our assumptions about what's good lawmaking. I think this is the kind of the long-term agenda here, and we are indeed doing that sort of research. I would stop here. I don't know, Sebastian or Cyril, you want to jump in on some of these questions?
I can very quickly on the theory and on omnibus legislation. So thanks again for the great questions. So I mean, just to complement what Vichy said about the theory. So I mean, indeed, we don't have theoretical assumption as the CAP project had basically, but the project is not theoretical. In the sense that the way we try to reflect or capture the legislative process, if you want, is very much informed, if you want, by the classics of legislative politics or legislative institutions, particularly formal models of bargaining or the legislative process. So it's really encoded, if you want, in that literature, and that's the kind of things that we try to reflect in the data collection process. And then the omnibus, I'm super happy to have you in the crowd, Itai. So it's indeed not omnibus in all countries because, as you know, I mean, having personally contributed on these debates, so I mean, the term doesn't exist in other cases. And so what we do is basically taking inspiration, in fact, for what you've done basically on your edited volume in particular. So for these countries in which the category of omnibus legislation doesn't exist, right, we try to approximate something, right? Which is taking these big laws, which also tend to be also more diverse, right? So that's what we are trying to do, right? It's still imperfect, but I think quite consistent with many contributions that you have in your book. But I'm happy to discuss that further on other occasions. Thanks.
Okay, we'll start this. Thank you. We'll start the second round of questions. Ruth, please.
Thank you. That's a really interesting study and a fantastic data set. And I wanted to follow up on the question about amendments. I've done a bit of work on trying to quantify amendments in UK legislation. And I quite agree, it is not easy to do so. With a colleague, I developed a fairly simple program or method of just automatically comparing the bill versions so that the amendments that have been accepted would come out of that comparison. And I was thinking that the fact you have, where possible, the text of the bill and the text of the law, is it in a state in which you could simply compare and see what the amendments were in the legislation? And the thing we found was quite a good proxy was the increase in length of the law compared to the bill, because things tend to get added. Occasionally they get taken out, but they mostly get added, as it turns out, during the parliamentary process. I spent a year as a parliamentary academic fellow in the House of Parliament, and you're quite right. It is incredibly difficult to find things. I actually had to go and talk to the people in the printing office, basically, to get useful files to compare. And so, well, I won't go into questions about that sort of technical side, but you're right. These things are getting better. But going back to 2006, were you having to work with PDFs, or could you get actual HTML type data? Anyway, I'll leave it there, but fascinating work.
Okay, we have a place maybe for one final question. Yes, please, Herman.
Yeah, maybe me. I wondered, some of you mentioned that law might be not the right unit for comparison because laws are so different from each other. What kind of different unit you would like propose, or what kind of different unit you have in mind to compare the issues at hand?
Great. Thanks for quickly answering because we don't have much time. So on amendments and comparing bill versions. So yes, this is great. Thanks a lot for this comment. Indeed, this is one of our ambitions. Vladislav Shatilov is here as a bright PhD student at CU. And in fact, one of his analysis is trying to explain the difference between the initial proposed version and a final accepted version, and how that is related to the nature of public consultation. So indeed, we started to work on these, again, piloting in the US for the moment, but we really would like to do this more systematically. So if you can share anything on your UK-specific work, would be great. We would be happy to learn from it, and I think this is a great avenue for further research. On the UK, so we have data in the UK back to 2006, exactly where the API is sharing data. Because for us, like going back to earlier data, we should love to do, but the nature of the data is different, like PDFs and all that. It's just so costly, like we would have to drop another country, right? So kind of earlier UK data versus, I don't know, Spanish Parliament. I mean, we opted for, mapping some further countries. So yeah, and we have a lot of these things. Like Italy is also a sort of nightmare because every time there's a new parliamentary session, they decide to change the parliamentary website. So it's sort of like many countries within one country. So we have a lot of these technical problems, and we make these trade-offs. So when you see like when our data starts, it's often just driven by the cost of collecting the data. I realized I haven't replied to one question, which is uses of text, which was an earlier question. So one of the things which we have in the pipeline but haven't gotten to it really is to look at the nature of the text, the laws, and the impact of various text features on companies' performance, right? So there is a great paper from Ottolinia on the Mexican law text and then special interest legislation. We want to go one step further and really look at whether companies donating and getting regulation after the donation, they have different kind of text regulating them versus sectors where there are companies not donating. So this sort of cycle of favoritism, you want to get that, and really the text will be crucial for that. For unit of analysis, I have two answers. One, we can do laws, we can use that, but we have to exclude some. So what we exclude currently is laws which are not laws in a classic sense. They just modify something. So they're very short, few hundred characters, like a paragraph long, if you like. They modify something, but they never modified themselves. So they don't become a law which can be modified. It's just basically changing something in an existing law. It's basically a technicality. They're relevant in terms of what they do on the main law, but on themselves, they're not an observation because they don't become a law, part of a long-standing piece of legislation. So that I think we can exclude some of these. And also discussion about what do we do with budget process, very different kind of laws from standard laws. They have an expiry date, of course, and they're often very different in nature. So again, we're going to exclude them or not. That's a big question. And finally, there's a lot of, especially in the EU, a lot of legislative activity in national parliament, which is transposition or some sort of bringing international treaty requirements into the national legislation. They are very different. Often there is no debate on these things, but it doesn't mean that there is no scrutiny. It's just scrutiny happened in the European Parliament, and then parliaments just transpose, and that's it. So again, do we want to exclude them, change the unit of observation, the number of observation or not? So that's the kind of less radical questions which are relatively easy to implement. The more radical answer is it's not a law, but the body of legislation regulating a sector is the unit of analysis, the full text, right? Because in a way, there are very few new laws, right? There's a law on, labor market in France, which is 60 or 80 years old and keep on just changing it, right? So it's not like we have a new legislation. It's just that bodies keeps on changing. So sort of taking more this idea of the codification and taking just main sectoral bodies of legislation and using that as an analysis. Of course, it's much harder to do then, but in many ways, it's closer to the real kind of what is legislation doing to society. So we don't have answers here. It's just lots of problems and questions and some indicators and filtering code for our data, but very much welcome ideas on this. And if it's something we can do, we would implement across the countries. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's already 2:02. So I think we'll end up here. And I would like again to thank Mihály, Cyril, and Sebastian for their really incredibly impressive effort. Congratulations on this. And probably not the only one here is actually quite curious to see how this project further develops. And we are also happy to have you here, maybe in a year or before, if you have anything interesting coming out of this project. Yeah, so thank you again for being with us today, and I wish all of you a very nice weekend ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Bye.